northern Wisconsin, near the Bayfield County line. Late October 1887. The most respected builder in 3 townships said it would kill his family by Christmas. A stone mason with 40 years of experience called it an abomination against natural law. The county building inspector, yes, they had one even then, threatened to condemn the structure before the first snow fell. What had Henrik Voss done to earn such fury? He put his chimney in the basement. Not a basement fireplace. Not a root cellar with a separate hearth. He took the main chimney flue from his cabin's firebox and routed it down through the floor, into a carefully designed channel of mortared stone that ran the length of his basement, before finally venting outside through an exterior stack. It looked insane. It violated every rule of chimney construction. Smoke rises. Heat rises. Everyone knew that. You don't fight gravity. You don't trap deadly gases below your living space. You don't create a horizontal maze for creosote to build up and catch fire. But Henrik Voss understood something about heat that the experts had forgotten or never learned in the first place. Today, you're going to see why the worst idea in Bayfield County became the most copied heating innovation in the region. You'll understand the physics that made it work, the numbers that silenced the critics, and the brutal winter that proved a Norwegian carpenter knew more about thermodynamics than men with decades of proper training. Subscribe now, because every week we bring you a real frontier technique that worked when survival wasn't optional. It was the only job that mattered. Hit that subscribe button, and you'll never miss a lesson from the people who lived when winter could kill you if you got it wrong. Now let's go back to 1887, when one man's mistake was about to save his family and change how an entire county stayed warm. Henrik Voss was not a dreamer. He was a carpenter by trade, Norwegian by birth, and practical by necessity. He'd arrived in northern Wisconsin in 1883 with his wife Ingrid, their 2 children, and exactly enough money to buy 40 acres of pine-studded land 3 miles from the nearest settlement. By 1887, he'd built a modest cabin, 16 by 24 feet, log walls chinked with moss and clay, a shingle roof that didn't leak much, and a stone fireplace at the north wall with a chimney that went straight up and out, just like every other cabin within 50 miles. And just like every other cabin within 50 miles, it was a study in thermal failure. The problem wasn't the fireplace itself. Henrik had built it well. Deep firebox, good draw, clean burning. On a cold November night, you could load it with split oak and get a roaring fire that turned the hearthstones orange and made the air near the ceiling almost uncomfortably hot. But 2 feet away from the fire? Cold. 6 feet away? Colder. And the floor? The floor was always cold. Ingrid kept wool rugs near the hearth, and the children, Bjorn, age 7, and little Carrie, just 4, would press their feet against the stones to warm them before bed. But by morning, frost formed on the inside of the windows. The water bucket near the door had a skim of ice. And the feeling in that cabin, even with the fire still glowing, was the feeling of cold creeping up from below. That's what nobody talked about. The floor. A cabin sits on a foundation, usually fieldstone piers or a dry-stacked stone perimeter. And beneath that floor is open space. Cold air. Air that moves. In winter, the wind doesn't just hit your walls. It goes under your house, and it pulls the warmth right through the floorboards. You can bank your fire, you can hang blankets over the windows, you can seal every crack in the walls, but that cold below you is always there, always stealing heat, always winning. And the chimney? The chimney was a thief in its own right. Every BTU of heat that rose into that flue and vented into the sky was heat that never warmed the cabin. The hotter the fire, the faster it pulled air and warmth up and out. You could burn a cord of wood a month and still wake up shivering, still feel that aching cold in your bones, still wonder if this was the winter you would make it through. Henrik watched his neighbors. Good men, hardworking men, men who cut wood from dawn to dusk and still ran out by February. Men whose wives boiled water on the stove just to add moisture and warmth to the air. Men whose children coughed all winter because the only warm spot was pressed against the hearth, breathing smoke. There had to be a better way. One night in early October, Henrik sat at his table with a piece of charcoal and a scrap of lumber, sketching. Ingrid watched him, mending a shirt by candlelight. The fire crackled. Outside, the first real cold of the season pressed against the walls. What if, Henrik said slowly, the chimney didn't go up first? Ingrid looked up. What do you mean? What if it went down? Into the basement, through stone, and then up. She frowned. Smoke rises, Henrik. I know, but heat can stay. He explained it to her the way he'd been working it out in his mind for weeks. If the flue descended into the basement and traveled horizontally through a channel lined with stone, thick, mortared stone, the heat from the smoke would transfer into that thermal mass. The stones would absorb it, hold it, radiate it back into the basement air, which would rise through the floorboards and warm the cabin from below. The chimney would still vent. The smoke would still escape, but the heat wouldn't be wasted. It would be captured, stored, and used. Ingrid set down her sewing. The men in town will call you mad. Henrik nodded. They will. And if it fails? He met her eyes. Then we freeze like everyone else. But if it works? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both knew what if it works meant. Warmth, safety, less wood, more time, a better chance. Build it, Ingrid said, and so he did. Henrik began in mid-October, when the ground was still workable and the frosts were light. He'd already dug out a small cellar beneath the cabin the previous summer. Nothing fancy, just a 7-foot deep space under the main floor, walled with dry-stacked fieldstone, used for storing root vegetables and keeping milk cool in summer. Now, that cellar was about to become the heart of his heating system. The plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. The firebox would remain on the main floor, set into the north wall, as it always had been. But instead of the flue rising vertically through the roof, it would descend, drop straight down through a carefully mortared stone sleeve into the basement. Once there, it would turn horizontal and travel the length of the cellar. 23 feet of flue channel, running just 18 inches below the floor joists, encased in stone that averaged 9 inches thick on all sides. At the far end, the flue would turn upward again, exiting the cabin through an exterior chimney stack built against the south wall. A full 40 feet of travel from firebox to open air. The entire horizontal section would be lined with heat-resistant sandstone, mortared with a mix of lime, sand, and clay. Every 6 feet, Henrik planned to install a clean-out port, a removable stone that could be pulled to clear creosote buildup. The channel would have a slight upward pitch, just 2 inches over its length, to encourage draft and prevent condensation from pooling. And surrounding that channel, filling the basement, would be thermal mass. Over 4,000 pounds of fieldstone, stacked and mortared into a low labyrinth that would absorb the radiant heat from the flue and hold it for hours. The theory was sound. The physics were basic. Hot gases transfer heat to surrounding material. Dense material stores heat. Stored heat radiates slowly over time. A standard chimney wastes that heat into the atmosphere. Henrik's chimney would capture it, store it, and turn his frozen basement into a thermal battery that would warm his cabin from the ground up. But to the men of Bayfield County, it looked like suicide. "You're going to suffocate your family," said Garrett McMullen, the master builder who'd constructed half the barns and churches within 20 miles. He stood in Henrik's yard on a cold morning in late October, arms crossed, face hard. Smoke doesn't go down and sideways. It goes up. You're fighting the draft. You're trapping gases. "I've calculated the draft," Henrik said calmly. "The vertical drop gives me velocity. The horizontal run is short enough to fill your basement with carbon monoxide the first time the wind shifts. I'm venting it outside, through an exterior stack. It'll draw, and when it doesn't, when you get a backdraft, when your children wake up dead." Henrik didn't flinch. There are clean-out ports, ventilation channels. The masonry is airtight. McMullen shook his head. "You're a fool, Voss, and I won't be part of this." He wasn't the only one. Anders Holmgren, the town's most experienced carpenter, stopped by 2 days later. He looked at the exposed basement, at the beginnings of the stone channel, at the mortared walls. "This is going to rot your floor joists," he said. "All that heat, all that moisture from combustion, it's going to condense on your floorboards. You'll have mold by spring and a collapsed floor by summer." "I'm insulating the joists with clay slip," Henrik replied, "and the heat will keep the wood dry." or it'll bake them brittle and they'll crack. Then I'll replace them." Holmgren spat into the dirt. "A real man builds his hearth where God intended, above ground, venting straight to the sky. This is cowardice against winter." That one stung. But Henrik kept working. The county building inspector, a lean, nervous man named Cyrus Pettigrew, came by in early November, just as Henrik was finishing the horizontal flue section. Pettigrew had a clipboard, a frown, and a reputation for shutting down anything that didn't match the building practices he'd learned back in Pennsylvania. "This doesn't meet code," Pettigrew said flatly. "There is no code for this," Henrik replied. "It's new." "Exactly. Which means it's unsafe. It's stone, mortar, and physics. What's unsafe about capturing waste heat?" Pettigrew tapped his pencil against the clipboard. "I could condemn this structure right now." Henrik straightened. He was not a tall man, but he had the hands of someone who'd swung an axe since childhood, and his voice carried weight. "You could, but you won't, because I haven't violated a single regulation you can name. I've used fire-rated distances. I've mortared every joint. I've built in ventilation and cleanouts. This is safer than half the cabins in this county, and you know it." Pettigrew's jaw tightened. "If someone dies in this house, Voss, it's on you. If someone dies in any house this winter, it's on the cold, not on the men trying to beat it." Pettigrew left without another word. But the damage was done. By the time Henrik sealed the final stone and lit his first test fire in mid-November, the entire township knew about the madman with the backwards chimney. Some folks laughed. Some shook their heads. Some prayed for his family. But no one, not one person, thought it would work. The first test fire was on November 14th, 1887. A cold, clear morning, temperature just above freezing, a light wind from the north. Henrik loaded the firebox with kindling and dry pine, struck a match, and watched as the flames caught. For a moment, nothing happened. The smoke rose into the flue opening, hesitated, seemed to pool, and Henrik felt a cold knot of doubt in his stomach. Then the draft kicked in. The smoke pulled down into the basement channel, and within seconds he could hear the low, steady roar of air moving through the stone labyrinth below his feet. He descended the basement stairs and checked the horizontal flue. Warm to the touch already. No smoke leaking, no backdraft. By noon, the basement was noticeably warmer. By evening, the floor of the cabin, standing on it in bare feet, was no longer cold. Ingrid pressed her hand against the floorboards and smiled. "It's working." Henrik nodded. But he knew the real test would come when winter arrived in full. He didn't have to wait long. On November 20th, Garrett McMullen showed up again, this time with two other men. Samuel Driscoll, a stonemason with a reputation for perfection, and Einar Korsgaard, a fellow Norwegian who'd been in the county since the 1870s and was considered an elder authority on frontier building. They stood in Henrik's cabin, feeling the warmth, and McMullen's face was stone. "You've got a fire going," McMullen said. "Let's see what happens when it's out." "It's been out since dawn," Henrik replied. "I loaded it last night at 8. Let it die naturally. Didn't touch it this morning." Driscoll frowned. He knelt and placed his palm flat on the floor. "This is warm. It's the stones below," Henrik said. "They're still radiating." "For how long?" "I don't know yet, but longer than a standard hearth." Korsgaard, the eldest of the three, descended into the basement. He spent 5 minutes down there, silent, running his hands over the stonework, checking the flue channel, inspecting the mortar joints. When he came back up, his expression was unreadable. "It's well built," Korsgaard said slowly. "I'll give you that. But you're asking your family to trust a system no one has proven. What happens when the real cold comes? When it's 20 below for a week straight? When the wind is howling and the draft reverses?" "The draft won't reverse," Henrik said. "The stack is tall enough and the channel is sealed. I've tested it." "You've tested it in November," McMullen cut in. "Wait till January. Wait till you're burning hot and fast and that flue gets choked with creosote. Wait till you can't clean it because it's 30 feet of serpentine stone. Then we'll see how smart you are. I have clean-out ports. You have a death trap." McMullen's voice was hard, final. "And when the county finds your family frozen, or worse, suffocated, they'll know who to blame." He turned and walked out. Driscoll followed. Korsgaard lingered a moment, his eyes on Henrik. "I hope you're right, Voss," he said quietly. "For their sake." Then he too left. That night, Ingrid sat by the fire, mending again, and Henrik could see the worry in her face. "Do you think they're right?" she asked. Henrik looked at his children, asleep on their straw mattresses near the hearth. He looked at the walls, the windows, the floor that, for the first time in 4 winters, wasn't stealing the warmth from his home. "I think they're afraid," he said. "Afraid that I'm right. Because if I'm right, it means they've been wrong." December came in cold and stayed that way. By Christmas, the snow was knee-deep and the temperature hadn't climbed above 10 degrees Fahrenheit in 2 weeks. Henrik's system held steady. One large fire in the evening, banked overnight, and the cabin stayed livable through to morning. The basement stones radiated warmth for hours, and the floor, previously a source of endless cold, now felt almost comfortable underfoot. But the real test came in January. On January 9th, 1888, a cold front moved down from Canada that would later be remembered as one of the worst in a generation. The temperature dropped to -15 Fahrenheit by nightfall. By the next morning, it was -23, and stayed there for 17 days. The wind came with it, a relentless, cutting wind off Lake Superior that drove the cold into every crack, every seam, every poorly chinked wall in Bayfield County. Families huddled near their hearths, burning through wood at an unsustainable rate. Children slept in their coats. Livestock died in barns. And the question on everyone's mind was not, will we be warm, but will we survive? Henrik's nearest neighbors, the Johansson family, lived half a mile east. Good people, hard-working. Their cabin was nearly identical to Henrik's. Log walls, stone foundation, a standard fireplace with a straight chimney venting through the roof. By January 12th, they were burning 4 cords of wood a week and running out. "We can't keep this up," Nils Johansson told Henrik when he came by to borrow an axe. His face was haggard, his hands cracked from cold and labor. "We're cutting everything we can find, and it's not enough. The fire goes out for an hour, and the whole place is frozen again." Henrik invited him inside. The difference was immediate. Johansson stepped through the door and stopped, blinking, as the warmth hit him. "How?" He looked around. The fire in the hearth was modest, not roaring, not consuming wood at a desperate rate. And yet the cabin was warm, not just near the fire, everywhere. "The floor," Johansson said, kneeling. "It's warm. The chimney runs through the basement," Henrik explained. "The stones hold the heat." Johansson stared at him. "That thing McMullen said would kill you." "The same." "Jesus, Henrik, how much wood are you burning?" Henrik thought for a moment. "1.5 cords this month. Maybe less." Johansson's face went slack. "We've burned 3 cords in 10 days. "I know. Can I—" Johansson hesitated. "Can I burn my family here? Just for tonight? Just so the children can sleep warm?" Henrik looked at Ingrid. She nodded. "Bring them," Henrik said. That night, 8 people slept in Henrik Voss's 16 by 24-foot cabin. It was crowded, uncomfortable, and a little awkward, but it was warm. And when morning came and Nils Johansson stepped outside into the -26-degree dawn, he turned back to Henrik with something like wonder in his eyes. "I need to see that basement," he said. Word spread. By January 15th, 3 more families had asked to see Henrik's system. By January 18th, Garrett McMullen himself, silent, grim-faced, stood in the basement, running his hand along the warm stone channel, saying nothing. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Henrik right. It humiliated every expert who'd called him a fool. By January 20th, the cold had been unrelenting for 11 days straight. The thermometer outside Henrik's cabin read -21 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Inside, the temperature was 68 degrees. 68 degrees. Not near the fire. Not pressed against the hearth. Everywhere. In the corners. Near the windows. At the far wall. The entire cabin held a steady, livable warmth that felt, for lack of a better word, impossible. Anders Holmgren, the carpenter who'd predicted rotted floor joists and structural failure, came by with a hand-built thermometer he'd borrowed from the town doctor. He didn't ask permission. He just walked in, placed the instrument on the table in the center of the room, and waited. 5 minutes later, he checked it. 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius. He moved to the corner farthest from the hearth. 66 degrees. He knelt and placed his hand flat on the floor. This shouldn't be possible. It's the stones, Henrik said quietly. 4,200 pounds of sandstone and fieldstone. They've been absorbing heat for 2 months. They don't cool fast. Holmgren descended into the basement. The air down there was dry and warm, not stifling, but noticeably warmer than the frozen ground outside. He touched the horizontal flue channel. It was warm, but not burning hot. The surrounding stones radiated a gentle, persistent heat that filled the space. When he came back up, his face had changed. The smugness was gone. The certainty was gone. What remained was something closer to disbelief. "How much would have you burned this month?" Holmgren asked. "1.5 quarts," Henrik replied. "Maybe a bit less. We've burned 3.5. And our cabin is 34 degrees inside right now." 34. Henrik said nothing. There was nothing to say. The numbers spoke for themselves. But Holmgren wasn't finished. He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and began writing. "I need to know everything. The flue dimensions, the pitch, the stone thickness, the clean-out intervals. Everything." Over the next 3 days, 7 men came to Henrik's cabin with notebooks, thermometers, and measuring tools. They weren't angry anymore. They weren't mocking. They were desperate to understand. Garrett McMullen came on January 23rd. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit he'd been wrong. But he stood in that basement for 20 minutes, silent, studying the stonework, the flue path, the thermal mass layout. Finally, he looked at Henrik. "What's the floor temperature?" McMullen asked. "This morning, before I reloaded the fire, it was 58 degrees, Henrik said. The fire had been out for 9 hours. McMullen blinked. 9 hours. Yes. And the cabin stayed livable. My children slept without coats. My wife didn't wake up shivering. We didn't add wood until after breakfast." McMullen walked to the hearth and looked at the modest fire burning there. It wasn't a roaring blaze. It wasn't consuming split oak at a ferocious rate. It was a normal, sustainable fire, the kind you'd burn on a cool autumn evening, not in the depths of a killing freeze. "Ow!" McMullen's voice was quieter now, almost respectful. "How did you know this would work?" Henrik thought for a moment. "I didn't, but I knew the standard way was failing. So I thought about where the heat was going, up and out, and I asked myself, what if it didn't? What if I kept it?" "Thermal mass," McMullen said slowly. "You turned your foundation into a battery. I turned waste into warmth." McMullen nodded. He extended his hand. Henrik shook it. "I was wrong," McMullen said, "and I'm man enough to admit it." By the end of January, the numbers were undeniable. Henrik Voss's cabin. Indoor temperature, sustained 66 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 19 to 20 degrees Celsius. Basement temperature, 58 to 62 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 to 17 degrees Celsius. Floor temperature, main level 62 to 64 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 to 18 degrees Celsius. Wood consumption, January 1888, 1.4 quarts heat retention after fire dies. 8 to 10 hours above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius thermal mass. For 1,200 pounds of stone radiating 18 to 20 hours per day, standard cabin, Johansson family. Half-mile away indoor temperature, sustained 34 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 to 9 degrees Celsius. Depending on fire. Intensity, basement, frozen, unusable floor temperature, 28 to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 to 0 degrees Celsius. Often ice formation. Wood consumption, January 1888, 3.8 quarts heat retention after fire dies. 2 hours before freezing returns. The comparison was stark. Henrik's cabin stayed twice as warm, using less than half the wood. His family slept comfortably. His children played barefoot on warm floors. His wife cooked without shivering. And his wood supply, cut and stacked in October, would last through March with plenty to spare. His neighbors, burning through their reserves at an unsustainable rate, faced a brutal choice. Cut more wood in sub-zero temperatures, or combine households and hope for an early thaw. The difference wasn't subtle. It was survival. And it all came down to one simple principle. Heat that escapes is heat you've wasted. Heat that stays, captured, stored, and radiated slowly over time, is heat that keeps you alive. Henrik Voss hadn't invented thermal mass. Humans have been using it for thousands of years. Roman hypocausts, Korean ondol floors, Russian masonry heaters. But he'd adapted it to the frontier, to the materials at hand, to the constraints of a log cabin built by one man with limited resources. And in doing so, he'd proven something the experts refuse to believe, that innovation doesn't always look like progress. Sometimes it looks like madness, until winter reveals the truth. The February thaw came in the first week of the month, and with it, a shift in the social landscape of Bayfield County. Garrett McMullen returned to Henrik's cabin on February 8th, this time with a proposal. He wanted to build a similar system in his own home. But more than that, he wanted to understand it, truly understand it, so he could help others do the same. I didn't account for thermal mass at foundation level, McMullen admitted. They were standing in Henrik's basement again, and McMullen was sketching in a notebook. I thought about draft, about structural integrity, about fire safety, but I never considered the stones themselves as part of the system. I thought they were just containment. They are containment, Henrik said, but they're also storage. Every BTU that hits this stone stays here for hours. It doesn't vent into the sky. It radiates into the space I'm trying to heat. McMullen nodded slowly. And the horizontal run. That's the key, isn't it? Maximum surface area in contact with the thermal mass. Exactly. A straight vertical flue minimizes contact time. The smoke rushes up and out. But a horizontal channel forces the heat to linger, to transfer, to stay. What about the draft? How do you keep it from stalling? Two things, Henrik explained. First, the initial drop from the firebox gives the gases velocity. Gravity helps. Second, the pitch, just 2 inches over 23 feet, keeps everything moving in the right direction. And the exterior stack at the end provides the final pull. Creosote buildup? That's what the clean-out ports are for. Every 6 feet. I open them once a month, brush out any accumulation, reseal. Takes maybe an hour. McMullen wrote furiously. When he finished, he looked up. I'm going to recommend this system to every builder in the county. With your permission. Henrik smiled. You don't need my permission, but I'd appreciate the credit. You'll get it. And he did. By late March 1888, 11 cabins within a 30-mile radius had begun incorporating basement heat channels into their construction. Some were new builds, others were retrofits, adding horizontal flue runs to existing fireplaces. The designs varied. Some used L-shaped routes instead of straight lines. Some added secondary warming chambers. Some integrated brick ovens into the system. But the core principle remained the same. Capture the heat, store it, use it. The Johansson family, whose desperate wood consumption had nearly bankrupted them that winter, hired a stonemason to retrofit their cabin in April. By the following November, they reported a 60% reduction in wood use and a floor that stayed warm enough for their children to play on without shoes. Einar Korsgaard, the elder Norwegian who'd warned Henrik of the risks, built a new cabin in the spring of 1889 with a basement heat channel that ran in a U-shape, maximizing thermal mass contact. He called it the Voss configuration and claimed it was the warmest house he'd ever lived in. Even Cyrus Pettigrew, the county building inspector who'd threatened to condemn Henrik's cabin, quietly updated his building guidelines in 1890 to include provisions for subsurface thermal flue systems, provided they met specific safety standards, standards largely based on Henrik's design. By the winter of 1889 to 1890, the Bayfield method was no longer an experiment. It was standard practice. And the phrase that stuck, repeated in taverns and workshops and front porches across the county, was this: Voss wasn't being stubborn. He was being Norwegian. It was said with a smile, with respect, with the acknowledgement that sometimes the outsider sees what the insider misses. That sometimes the wrong way is the only way that works. That sometimes the man everyone mocks is the man who changes everything. Henrik never sought fame. He never wrote a book or gave lectures or claimed to have invented anything. He built a system that worked, shared it freely, and watched as his neighbors, former critics included, adopted it, adapted it, and made it their own. And every winter, when the cold came howling down from Canada, and the snow piled high, and the wind cut through the trees like a blade, the people of Bayfield County slept a little warmer, burned a little less wood, and remembered the carpenter who'd put his chimney in the basement, and proven that survival isn't about following the rules. It's about knowing when to break them. Now tell us, which part of this solution would you apply to your home today? Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because every week we bring you a real technique from the frontier, tested by winter, proven by survival, and ready for you to use. Innovation, when it first appears, rarely looks like genius. It looks like foolishness. It looks like risk. It looks like a man digging a trench where a chimney should rise, mortaring stones into a basement labyrinth, and telling his neighbors that heat can flow downward before it flows up. Henrik Voss didn't have a degree in thermodynamics. He didn't have access to modern insulation materials or computer modeling or peer-reviewed research. He had stone, mortar, a saw, and the brutal honesty of a northern Wisconsin winter. And that winter, the winter of 1888, one of the coldest in living memory, didn't care about credentials or conventions or the opinions of master builders. Winter only cared about one thing. Does your system work? Henrik's did. Today, we call his innovation radiant floor heating with thermal mass storage. We use electric coils or hydronic tubing instead of stone-lined flues. We have building codes and safety standards and engineered systems that cost thousands of dollars. But the principle, the fundamental insight that saved Henrik's family and changed his community, remains the same. Heat that escapes is heat you've lost. Heat that stays, held in mass and released slowly, is heat that works for you. The pioneers didn't have YouTube tutorials. They didn't have online forums or step-by-step guides or customer support. They had winter, and winter, in its cold and unforgiving way, was the greatest teacher they ever had. Because winter never lies. If your system works, you survive. If it doesn't, you freeze. Henrik Voss survived, and in doing so, he left behind a lesson that echoes across the centuries. Sometimes the best way forward is the way no one expects. Sometimes wisdom looks like madness. And sometimes the man everyone laughs at is the man who changes the world. Stay warm out there. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.